Eric Tulsky is in his 8th season with the Hurricanes, and his second as assistant general manager. As assistant general manager, Tulsky assists in all hockey-related matters while also overseeing the team's hockey information department. Tulsky previously served as vice president of hockey management and strategy. Tulsky has been publishing his advanced hockey statistical analysis since 2011, when he began writing for BroadStreetHockey.com. He also contributed to NHLNumbers.com prior to launching his own website through SB Nation Outnumbered. Tulsky has been a featured panelist for MIT's annual Sports Analytics Conference, and his hockey analysis work has been published in the Washington Post and the 538.com. A Philadelphia, Pennsylvania native, Tulsky holds a BA in chemistry and physics from Harvard University and a Ph.D. in chemistry from UC-Berkeley. He also conducted a 2-year postdoc study at the Naval Research Lab in Washington, D.C., and worked in nanotechnology for 12 years. Tulsky's research has helped enable unique nanotechnology solutions to problems in DNA sequencing, solar energy displays, and energy storage. And he holds 19 US patents. Eric, I will make you presenter now so you can share your screen.
Thank you.
Yeah, please join me in welcoming Eric.
Thanks. So actually, before I get into my talk, Seth said something that resonated for me, and so I want to spend a minute agreeing with him and echoing it a little bit more. I'll tell you a story. I actually taught a course in sports analytics at Santa Clara University, and they reached out to me and asked me to do it. And I said, I don't think you have the right person, right? Like, my training is in chemistry. I don't have a strong statistical background. I've taught myself a little bit, but I shouldn't be teaching graduate students how to do this. You need someone more qualified than me. And they explained to me the reason they were coming to me was they had started this data science program, and they had met with leaders from companies like Google and Facebook and whatever other companies that were heavily involved in data science and machine learning, and asked them what they wanted to see from their students that they were looking to hire. They said there were 3 things they were looking for. One was computer programming skills, one was statistical analysis skills, and what the companies told the university was every program turns out people with those 2 skills. What most programs seem to overlook is the 3rd thing, which is an understanding of how to use data and intuition about where to go with it and how to think about it. And they were asking me to teach a class in that. And I was like, perfect, that's what I am good at, is thinking through sort of where your analysis might be wrong, how to come up with an answer to a question like who's the best 3-point shooter, when you're gonna have a bunch of murky pieces of information that don't quite tell the whole story. And reasoning through that, I think, is a real skill, and it's something you can practice. And the way I had my students practice it was we took papers from blogs or journal articles, and we talked through, if this turns out to be wrong, what's the most likely reason why, and how could we test for that, and how could we think about it? And I think that is something that you can do on your own or with others, and just train your creativity and your problem solving to think about how to get a complete answer. With that being said, I will now pivot to the actual point of my talk. So, see my screen now?
Yes.
So my talk today is about, as a team employee, how we can make use of work that's in the public domain. And you heard from my introduction, I spent a few years writing in the public domain. I've worked in academia, publishing in academic journals. I've done sports analysis for blogs. And so I kind of have had my foot in each of these areas. And I think that makes me well positioned to think about how to get good use from all of them. So I'm going to start by talking through, there are some real advantages to being in-house, and I will highlight those a little bit. But the point of my talk, and what I want to get to, is talking about what the strengths are from public domain work and why teams should be paying attention to that as well. And then kind of what the best practices are and how to make use of everything. So let's start with the movie. We're going to watch a football play here. And first run through, let's just see what happens. Okay. So the Rams scored a touchdown there. And as an analyst, the first question you might ask is, how much is that play worth? And there are a variety of ways of thinking about that. Right? So one simple answer is, well, you get 7 points for a touchdown. But that's not quite right. You really get 6 points and a chance at a point after touchdown. Point after is almost always good, but not quite always. So if you count for those missed ones, maybe it's a little bit under 7. But where analysts start getting involved is you might say, well, okay, you got 7 points on that play, but you had a chance to score even before that. And if you think about, they were near midfield, you know, when you work through the likelihood that they were going to score their kind of expected points from that possession, that play really only increased their expected outcome by about 5 points. And other analysts might say, well, points aren't the goal here. The goal is wins. So let's not even talk about expected points. Let's talk about win probability. And that play increased their chance of winning the game by 7%. Someone else might talk to this last two and say, hold on, when you're talking about expected points or win probability, are you using average teams here, or are you factoring in how much better this team is than their opponent? Because I think they were already 94% to win the game before that play, so it couldn't have increased their chances by 7% when you think about how good they were. All these are reasonable questions. Any of these frameworks is a reasonable way to think about it. And you kind of have to decide which framework you want to use. But once you do that, you can calculate an answer to this. There is a right answer to what this play is worth, and you can work through all of the things you want to think about in your framework and come up with that answer. Where things get harder is when you want to talk about individual players. And if we think this play was worth 5 points or 7 win %, how much credit do we give to each player? So I've highlighted here the receiver who's going to get open. He runs what's called a post route. He runs down the field about 20 yards and then cuts diagonally across the field. These are the 3 defenders who end up trailing him on the play. And so I want you to think about which of them deserves the blame for this. Who should have been going with him? So you've seen it a second time now. I hope you were watching those 3 defenders. Let's back up a little bit here to the key point where they kind of lose him and he breaks into the open. I want to take a poll now. So decide for yourself, do you think it was player number 1's fault, player number 2's fault, player number 3's fault? Let's raise your hand if you think it was player number 1 who should have been with him. Raise your hand if you think it was number 2. Raise your hand if you think it was number 3. Okay, so I can't see any of your hands, so that was kind of a silly exercise. But I'm going to tell you, even without seeing your hands, that all of you were wrong. And the reason you're wrong is you just don't have enough information to answer the question. So what I can tell you is, on this kind of play, player number 1 is responsible for these short routes. He carries the player down the field through the early part of the route. And then player 2 and 3 are responsible for the deep parts of the field. Their job is to protect against the deep plays. So player number 2 is on this side of the field. He has 2 guys coming into his area, and he just can't cover both of them. And so his job has to be the one to the outside because there's no help there. So it's definitely not his fault. But what's unclear is whether player number 1 should be staying with the receiver as he goes down the field, or whether player number 3 should be recognizing what that offensive player is doing and getting over to pick him up. And the reason you can't answer is different coaches would ask the players to do different things here. Some coaches would say, player number 1 can see that number 2 is occupied and he can't release this guy. He knows he needs to stay with him. Other coaches would say number 1 is going to be behind him because his job was these short routes. So we need number 3 to be the one who recognizes that number 2 is occupied and get over the top. And it's just not, if you don't know what the coaches were telling them, you can't assign the blame. And so that's why access is important. That's one of the advantages that people working for a team have, is you really can't assign blame until you know what people were being asked to do. You can't assign credit until you know what their job was on the play either. So when you start with how impactful was this play, you can do that without access. But when you want to assign the credit, you need to be able to sort through, maybe the coaches deserve credit for designing routes for the receivers that created this pressure on the defense. Maybe the defensive coaches deserve some blame for designing a coverage scheme that had this weakness. Maybe the receiver deserves some credit for executing this route well, for being fast enough or deceptive enough to get into that weak spot. And then probably at least one of the players in coverage deserves some blame for not recognizing what was happening and making the coverage. And that's just for the part where the receiver gets open. You have all these same questions when you think about why the quarterback had so much time and how the blockers performed and what they were being asked to do. This is all a hard problem in general, but without the access to know what they were being asked to, it's not a solvable problem. You can only estimate. And so that is going to be a limitation for people who are working in the public domain. Another limitation they'll often face is just the quality of the data. So I'm going to shift to hockey now and show you a play from our team. Carolina Hurricanes were in white, playing against the Columbus Blue Jackets. So the Blue Jackets send the puck out, we gather it, and we bring it back in. Now this is not a terribly dangerous situation. We have 2 offensive players against 2 defensive players who are in pretty good position. There's 2 more players behind them coming down to close it down. So it shouldn't be that dangerous until he gets over there and wow, the puck's in the net. That was amazing. Everybody's really excited. We got to have a hug for that one. Goalie's disappointed. The coach cannot figure out what happened. He's looking for information. Somebody explain to me what happened there. The player wants to know too, how did I make that happen? And so let's turn to the NHL and see what the NHL data can tell us. This is what an NHL play-by-play looks like. There's a series of events. So there's a face-off that we won in the offensive zone. The next thing they record is one of our players missed a shot. One of their players hit somebody, and so on. And what I want to focus on at the bottom here, so this is the goal that you just watched. And the play before it, you can see, was 23 seconds earlier. So we have a 23-second gap between when one of our players hit someone in the offensive zone and the goal being scored. We have no information about what happened in those 23 seconds. And to give you an idea of how long 23 seconds is, these columns show which players were on the ice for each team. And you can see that in between, aside from our goalie, all 5 of our players left the ice. So the NHL provides a blogger with no information about what any of our 5 guys did to make this happen, other than that we scored. So you can record, as a team, we created a dangerous chance from 4 feet away. We converted on it, scored a goal, but assigning individual credit to players for how that came about is going to be pretty hard without more data. And when you want to divide it up, you need to have a more rich play-by-play or more information than what was here. At the season level, you might be able to infer a player's impact by looking at how often good things happen when they're on the ice, how often bad things happen, and maybe you can correct for who he's playing with, who he's playing against, what kind of situations he's in. But on any individual play, trying to say what he did, you just don't have the data from the NHL's play-by-play. People in the public domain have started trying to fill in that hole. They've started tracking things by hand to record more of the individual contributions and make that more rich play-by-play that tells you things like who passed the puck to the player that got the scoring chance and what kind of pass was it. And that helps a lot. It gets you one step closer to being able to do what you want to do. But to really do it well, there's a level of detail that you really just can't do it by hand at scale. So you might be able to go through, if there's 20 or 30 scoring chances in a game, you might be able to record the pass that led to each of those and some information about that pass. But if we're going to talk about a sequence of 5 or 10 passes that led up to it and what each player did, it's going to be really hard to record that much information. And if you want to start talking about all of the movements that players made to make that pass possible, which offensive player cut somewhere to occupy a defender, which defender lost his man in coverage, that's going to be essentially impossible to do by hand. And if you want to talk about the passer, you need to not just know what pass he made, but what other passing options he had available and didn't make, so that you can start to grade his vision. You can see where there's a level of information that you're never going to be able to record. And so those are the two things that I think give an in-house analyst the most advantage. The access to coaches to understand what players were being asked to do, and the data to really track in detail the extent to which they did it. And data here, I talked about play-by-play. You heard that in field hockey, as well as other sports, there's GPS trackers to keep track of where players are at all times. Data also includes things like scouting reports, and basically any information we have. There's a lot of information that we collect in-house that someone in the public domain might not have access to. And so there is a real advantage to being in-house, and there are reasons why people who are working for teams tend to assume they have all the information and there isn't much to add from the public domain. And I think that there's a step that they're missing there. They do have all of the information and a lot of advantages, but there are still some real advantages from the public domain, and I think it's important to think those through and take advantage of them wherever you can. So I'm going to pivot now to talking about why I think the public domain has a lot to offer and how we can go about making use of that. So one simple advantage is just technical horsepower. Teams invest a lot in this stuff, but there is a really broad world outside of teams. So somebody named Shana Goldman compiles a list of everybody who's on team websites in what appears to be a data adjacent role. And there are about 100 of them across the league. Something like 32 of them have a degree in a STEM field based on my searches of team bios and LinkedIn and whatever else I can find. Included 22 graduate degrees. That's a lot of horsepower. If you get 100 people together with 22 graduate degrees and 30 STEM degrees, there's a lot of ability there and a lot that you could do. When you compare it to what exists in the broader world, it's not really that much. Just one university nearby us, NC State, in just one department, their statistics department, they have 41 faculty members and 125 graduate students. So just that one department at the one school has more horsepower than the entire NHL does. Now, obviously they aren't all working on hockey yet, but like we heard in the field hockey example in the opening remarks, once you start giving those people some interesting data and putting interesting problems in front of them, they're not going to be able to help but get engaged and want to help you solve some of these problems. And I do think there is an ability to tap into that teams can take real advantage of. So some examples of work that's being done in the public domain. I think the academic research literature is a really good place to find people using that horsepower to develop some innovative techniques and apply the cutting edge best practice methods to solving problems. So I have an example here. There's an old rule that when somebody on an organizing committee invites you to give a talk at a symposium, you have to make sure you return the favor by promoting some of their work. So this is a plot from a publication that looked at how often the best team wins across sports. And that's something where the arithmetic can be done in an individual sport in a relatively simple way. The innovation that they had in this paper was coming up with a way to compare across sports and make it so that you could start answering questions like, how much more random is an NHL playoff series than an NBA playoff series? And as a league, we might be interested in that kind of question and whether we have too much or too little randomness. Another example of technical horsepower comes from a more hockey-specific example here. So I'll give you some background for people who are not neck deep in hockey. The NHL is the top league in hockey, but lots of other leagues are of interest to us as well. There are prospects and free agents who come out of leagues all over the world. And in the draft, we need to think about all the leagues they're coming from as well. And so when we want to think about how to evaluate a player, we need to have some sense of how strong each of those leagues are. And it's a little bit like the minor league issue in baseball, but I think it's significantly more challenging here because you're trying to compare such disparate leagues, from the NHL to a Canadian junior hockey league where everybody's 21 and under, to the top men's professional league in Russia, to the minor league in Russia, to the under 18 league in Sweden. There are all these different leagues, and comparing across them is not easy. And it's something that we knew was important, and for a long time people were doing it in a kind of simple pairwise fashion, where you take players who are in one league one year and move to another league the next year and look at how their production changed and take that as an assessment of which league is stronger. And you can do that in a pairwise fashion, but you run into problems where the translation from League A to League B says something, the translation from League B to League C says something, but if you chain those together, you get a different answer from if you go straight from A to C. And so the innovation in this paper that I'm citing was using some more advanced statistical methods to model globally the translation factors across all the leagues and take into account all of those individual interactions to try to really stack rank the leagues and make it so that we can start to compare prospects and potential free agent signings from all over the world. So there's a lot of technical horsepower in the public domain. There are 100 team employees, and that is a lot, but it's not 100 employees working in a single group. Right? We're in 32 individual teams that are by design isolated. And when you start cutting things up like that, those individual groups are actually not that big. And there's a loss of connectivity there that I think is really important. People, when you think of an inventor or an invention, the sort of stereotype is this guy in a lab by himself, locked away, no contact with any humans, until he comes out running excited and screaming about his fantastic new invention. And that's really not how invention works. Invention comes from having conversations with people who see things differently from you and letting your ideas cross-pollinate with theirs and come up with new things. And that's something that obviously the public domain can do in a way that a team that's trying to get a proprietary edge can't as easily. So I'll give you another example of a place where that showed up in hockey. So transitioning to thinking about expected values comes pretty early in most sports. Those of you familiar with baseball probably have heard of the run expectancy matrix. Those of you familiar with soccer have thought about expected goals. There's expected points in American football. Each sport has kind of made this transition. And just like all the other sports, early on in hockey, people said, oh, we need to be able to make an expected goals model, predict how likely it is that a shot will go in, and stop just counting shots, switch to counting expected goals. They did that early on and went to use it to make predictions and found out that it was actually worse than just counting shots. And that's strange, and it's hard to believe until you think about what that data looked like. And when you have these huge gaps in the data and really not very much information about what happened, it may be that your expected goals calculation isn't reliable enough to make those kind of predictions. And there was a decade of back and forth in blogs where people were coming up with new innovations about how to add a little bit more information to the shot, how to tease apart things from the sequence of events in the play-by-play to tell you a little bit more than what we had from just the individual play. And that back and forth over 10 years eventually got to where there was a published model that had a test of predictive power and showed that it improved predictions over just using simple shots. And that discourse, that back and forth, would have been a lot harder to do in a team environment. And I think that's a really important thing for finding flaws in your approach and coming up with new wrinkles to consider. So tying things together a little bit here, I I think those new ideas are one of the most precious commodities there is in any research field, really. And going through blogs and journals is a really valuable way to find some of those ideas. And maybe you're just using their idea as is, or maybe it triggers something for you. And you think about how you can take the data that you have or the access that you have or some other problem that you've been thinking about and use their idea as a starting point for approaching this thing. You can also be more active and get researchers in the public domain engaged in working with your fancy data. So I have a couple examples here. The one on the left is from hockey, where one of those enriched play-by-plays that has information about every pass was provided to contestants in a data competition. And this example here solves the problem that we talked about in the hockey video of assessing the impact of each pass in sequence and what all the players did individually to lead to an opportunity to score. The one on the right is from an NFL's data competition where contestants were given information about the location of players at all time and solved the problem that we had from our football play of assessing at what point the player became open and how likely they were to complete the pass. And this didn't actually get into who was responsible for that, but you could see where a starting point of identifying when and where they came open and how open they were would get you towards that. And so I think this kind of opportunity to engage people in the public domain and have them come up with ideas for you or with you and work through some of the ways about how to solve them is something that teams really can get a lot of benefit from. I'm going to pivot now and talk about something that I think is separate from those other things in a certain way. It's a form of benefit just from having an outside opinion. So there are always going to be challenges when you're trying to evaluate your own team. There's, just as a starting point, I think leaders are almost always inherently optimistic. It's part of what makes people good at selling their vision and getting people excited to work with them is being able to explain why you think this is right and be excited about it and have that be a genuine belief that what you're doing is the right way to do it. That optimism is good for getting people excited about your problem, but it does have a downside when it comes time to assess your situation. There are also some psychological biases. So confirmation bias is the tendency to, when you have an opinion, pay more attention to and give more weight to evidence that supports your opinion than to evidence that contradicts your opinion. And so that's an inherent tendency that people have. And so if you think a certain player is good and go out and acquire them, and then you start watching them, you're going to have a tendency to recognize and remember the things he does well and say, I knew it, that player's really good, and maybe overlook some of the things that he struggles with a little bit. And that will tend to make you even more optimistic about your players and your team. The endowment effect is another psychological bias that can play in. So that's the tendency to value objects or assets that you have more than you would value an equivalent object or asset that is not currently in your possession. So if you have a player and a team comes to you and says they're interested in the player, they'll trade you a third-round draft pick for him. Your reaction might be, no way, this guy's incredibly valuable. He's worth way more than a third-round pick. Some other team has a similar player and ask if you would give up a third-round pick for them. And you say, of course not. That guy's not worth anywhere near as much. And it's essentially a form of overvaluing your own players. And again, all of these psychological biases lead to teams being a little more optimistic about their team than they should be in general. But I think there's something even more insidious underlying that leads to hyper-optimism, even if you have no psychological effects at all. So let's imagine I build a robot, we program the robot to evaluate players and teams and let it make all our decisions. I think that robot's still going to be too optimistic about whatever team it builds. And I'll take a minute to walk you through why that would be. So let's imagine we have this hockey player, he's a free agent, and we need to decide what he's worth. Now, you can't really know for sure, right? We have not yet solved hockey to the point where we can say unequivocally what a player's value is. For the sake of this conversation, let's assume we have access to an omniscient being, and that omniscient being tells you and me that this player's worth $3 million. But the rest of the teams in the league don't know that, and we're going to sit back and watch what happens. So they each have their own opinions. They each see the game a little bit differently. Maybe their scouts saw the player at different games, and they each have different opinions about what the player's worth. It's just, at the low end, one team manager thinks the player's worth about $2.5 million. At the high end, one team manager thinks he's worth about $4 million. So when we go into this auction in free agency, the person who thinks he's worth the most will end up being the one who signs him. He will effectively outbid the other teams. But when you think about how much he signs him for, he doesn't have to pay $4 million for him, right? The agent starts going to teams. He's asking for $2 million. Everybody's in the bidding. It gets to $2.5 million, and the first person drops out of the bidding. Get up to $3 million, the second person drops out. You get above $3.5 million, and the third person drops out. And this guy on the end maybe has to pay a little bit more than 3.5. Maybe it's 3.51. Maybe it's 3.6. But it's not $4 million. So how does he feel about that outcome? He thinks he got a bargain, right? He thinks he paid $500,000 less than he should have. While everybody else is saying they're, maybe this third guy is saying, yeah, that's a reasonable price, a little more than I wanted. But the other two are saying, that is way too much. And nobody in the league knows what the right answer is. All we know is that the person who ended up with him is the one who is most optimistic about it, and he thinks he just won. That's not just true in free agency. We see it in the draft too. So every year you will hear team executives come out and say, we were picking 37th and we got this guy who was 15th on our draft board. I can't believe how lucky we were. And when I was in the public domain, I'll be honest, I didn't really buy it. It sounded like something they would just say to try to get fans excited about their draft pick or hype up what a good position the team was in or whatever. But when I started to see how different teams' draft lists were and think about what that means for this kind of situation, you realize that it actually generally is true, because it's exactly the same as the free agency situation. I guess not exactly the same, because you don't always have the opportunity to acquire the player who you like the most. If you had him 15th and your next pick was at 30th, maybe somebody else takes him at 27th who didn't like him as much as you did. So it's not quite like free agency where it's always going to go to the team that wants him most, but you're still going to tend to end up with the players who other teams wouldn't have taken that by. And you're going to come out of the draft every year saying you got really lucky that a bunch of players fell to you who you would have had ranked ahead of a bunch of people who went earlier. And that happens at every step to acquire players, and it creates a selection bias. Whether we're talking about free agency or trades or the draft, every time you're adding a player to your roster, the tendency will be to end up with a player who you like more than most of the other teams do. And so you're going to like your team more than most other teams do. And you might be right. Maybe you know more about how to evaluate players than anyone else in the league does. Maybe they have it wrong and you have it right. But if everybody thinks they have it right and they all disagree, they can't all be right. They can't all have teams that are better than average. And so some teams are way too optimistic about their situation. And if you're working for a team, it's incumbent on you to think about how to assess how confident you should be in your opinion about your team. And that's really important, because that assessment of your team plays in when you make decisions about what to do. There are lots of opportunities to essentially trade future assets for current assets. And if you think your team is really good right now, there's a lot of incentive to do that. But what if you're wrong? And you need to understand, no model is perfect. There's that old saying, but that includes whether you're using an actual quantitative model or any method you use to decide how good you think your team is. It's not going to be perfect. And those imperfections tend to make you more optimistic than you should. And I think where there's real value is in essentially ensembling opinions. And the good news is the internet has no shortage of opinions about what a team's likely win total will be, or their odds of making the playoffs, or whatever it might be. And so there's a lot of chance there to check your gut instinct or your internal models and see whether the rest of the world agrees with you. Now, you might be right. I'm not saying you automatically abandon your opinion, but you need to question it if they disagree. If they agree with you, then maybe you go ahead and make your moves with confidence. But if they disagree, you need to spend some time thinking about why. If you can't answer why those models in the public domain are higher on other players than on yours, then you need to be really careful about thinking about whether you're right. You still might be, but you have to have that caution. So I'll put it all together now and think about whether the public domain work, whether paying attention to it really does lead to an edge in practice. So I'll take one last hockey example here. This is another series of articles that were looking at the draft. So taking into account how old the player was, how many points he scored, what league he played in, a bunch of information, and trying to project what their future looked like, how likely they were to make it, how good they were likely to be if they did. And this was interesting work, and some teams around the league were paying attention to it. And some of them were using it directly, and some of it were using it as inspiration for further extensions. And one team actually went further. They went and recruited the researchers who developed this work and integrated them with their scouting staff as consultants. And they gave a talk at the MIT Sports Conference a couple of years back, detailing exactly how they blended their work into their decision-making processes. And that's how I know they got a lot of value out of it, because not only did they go do it, but they were happy enough with it to be going out and talking about it and showing examples of players where combining the information they had from these models with the information they had in-house helped them make decisions. So in terms of best practices, I think passively monitoring the research that's in the field is important. Just knowing what's out there, being able to find those articles about the draft and think about how you can use them. But active engagement is even better. Having these conversations with researchers gives you a chance to sneak out of your little silo every now and then and come across some new ideas and get people engaged. If you can partner with academic groups or student interest groups, there's a sports analytics club at NC State that we worked with for a little while, and that was 50 undergrads who were immediately enthusiastically working on problems with us. There's an opportunity to tap into the horsepower and the connectivity that way. Like participating in the occasional conference is important. You can do that as a referee, as a speaker, or as an attendee. And if you do all of these things well, I think the public work can be a constant source of new ideas and eventually, like we saw in the example, new hires and new ways of looking at your own work. And just leaving you with that last thought that ensembles really do almost always beat individual models. And it's the job of people who work in teams to make use of every piece of information they have. So with that, I will stop here and I would be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Eric. Now it's time for questions. We can take questions from the Q&A window. If you click the bottom right, I think on my screen it's 3 dots. If you click on it, there you will see a Q&A session. So please input your question there. And of course, panelists, you're feel free to ask. Just unmute yourself. You can ask. Okay, so we got one question. How do you determine what parts of the public domain are trustworthy and valuable to use?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it is. I think there's 2 ways of thinking about it. One is, on some level, everything is valuable, even if the research is in some fundamental way just kind of misguided. having someone throw stuff out there, whether it's right or wrong, might get you thinking about something new. And so spending a little bit of time just reading everything has some value. But you do ultimately need to have that intuition for which things are most valuable, most well underpinned in terms of the quality of the study and the quality of the data they have. And that is, like I said in my little introduction, I think that is a skill that you can develop over time for getting a sense for what is most likely to sort of hold up under scrutiny and what kind of tests you can use to scrutinize it.
Oh, that question was from Alex Harriman. Now, the next question is from Darren O'Shaughnessy. Have you seen a good example of crowdsourced data collection by a club?
So by the club, there's a caveat there that makes it tricky. I think let me start by saying we know teams are very siloed. And I think it's a good bet that lots of teams have done this and I just didn't know about it. But in terms of the things that I actually know about, I think most teams, when they go to crowdsourced data, generally do it through a company. Right? So there are companies that will collect data for you and provide it. And most teams, I think, would not want to get into the business of trying to organize a crowdsourced data collection effort. That being said, in the public domain, there are crowdsourced efforts. I actually led one back in 2012 or 13 where we got 30 or 50 different people watching games. I gave them a template for things we wanted to watch for them, some instruction, and we assembled a pretty robust data set that let us draw some interesting conclusions.
Next question is from Stefan Paziala. Hi, Eric. How do you overcome the challenge of not having a playing career in the NHL? We see now in the MLB, most presidents have zero playing experience, and the NHL is trending in that direction. How have you overcome this barrier, and what is the value of having an analytical mind in charge rather than a former player, i.e., don't swing me off the Bruins?
Yeah, I think this is a real question, that there are things that you understand about the game from having seen it from a player's perspective. And there is a level of understanding, I think, whether playing or coaching, I think players and coaches understand the systems better than somebody who hasn't played or coached is likely to. They understand more about what's going on at any given second and about what each person needs to think about and what the responsibilities are. It's a full-time job for a coach to think about all these different wrinkles and what they're going to do. And of course, it's impossible for me to be as good at it as they are. And so they're always going to know more about those things. That what's important for me to be able to do is communicate with them in a way that they can understand. And so I don't have to have as much understanding as they do about exactly the best way to design a breakout scheme. But I need to be able to communicate with them and learn from them about why we're doing the things we're doing and what people are asked to do, and help them see what information I can collect and how it can help assist what they're doing. And so I think there is real value in having that on ice experience or on the bench experience. I don't think it's the only thing that's valuable, though. And we have a blend of people in our front office. We have people who played, we have people who coached, we have people who have only been in management. And I think having those different perspectives with an innovative environment, a collaborative environment, and a communicative environment is what ends up making the group most successful.
The next question is from Otto Kaufman. Why do not go to overtime when lose no points and get a point for a lose?
Not quite sure I understand. I assume the question here is in the NHL standings are a little bit weird because teams that lose in overtime still get a point. And that dates back to when there were ties in the NHL. Teams at the end of the game often got very conservative, just trying to protect the point they had in their tie. And the league wanted to discourage that conservative play. And so they moved to this model where you don't want the game to end with both teams just not taking any chances, trying to protect the point they have. And so they added in the overtime loss point to make it so, okay, you get that point whether you win and lose. Now go play hard and try and get the extra point for winning. So it makes the standings a little bit different from other sports, and I know it causes some confusion, but there was a reason for introducing it.
A question from Nicholas Waltz. What is your best advice for a graduate student with a background in sports science who wants to further get into the data analytics side of the business? I graduate in May, thanks.
Yeah, so getting into the business is hard. Like, the challenge is if I post a position tomorrow, I'm going to have 500 resumes, and they won't all be qualified, but a lot of them will be. And it's hard for me as a hiring manager to figure out if that big pile of resumes who the most talented candidate is, who the best fit is. And so the job of the applicant is to find a way to stand out. And there are basically two ways that I've seen people be effective at getting a little bit extra attention on their resume. One of them is having done work in the public domain and having a portfolio of existing research that the hiring manager can look at and say, you know, oh, look, they did some interesting work. I like the way this person thinks. That's obviously the path I took, and I think people often, when they're asked how to go about getting into a field, end up just describing what worked for them. So that's what worked for me. I know it's one option. I think the other thing that can really help is networking and having internships and other things like that. Because if you have an internship on your resume saying you worked at this team, the first thing I'm going to do when I get your resume is call my buddy who works for that team and ask what he thinks of you. And if he liked you, all of a sudden you're on the short list already because I've already got someone telling me, no, this is someone who's worth talking to. So I know not everyone's always in a position to be able to take an internship, but I think taking every opportunity to network that you can, and if you have the ability to do some internships, I think it can really help. But just making it so that you have those ways on your resume to make it so that somebody who has this big pile of resumes can figure out which ones are the standout ones helps a lot. Now, that being said, in my own personal hiring practices, I guess since I've been with the team, I've hired 3 people, and 2 of the 3 were people I had never heard of before I posted the job and didn't have any personal references from. So it is possible to just have a compelling resume and interview well and get a job. But if you're looking for a leg up and giving yourself the best chance, I think either a portfolio of public work or something like an internship are the easiest ways to increase your chances.
Question from Thomas Reeves. How much information do you collect and analyze regarding the actions and tendencies of the officiating crew for your games?
We have some information on that. We do some things with it. I think there's been a lot of that in sports like basketball and baseball, where the officials are playing an active hand in every play. In hockey, for the most part, the officials are observing. There are only a few penalties called per game, and most of them are obvious enough that any ref would have called it. And so there are not that many opportunities to try to game the system by knowing something about the officials. But we do still pay attention and make sure that we have whatever information we might be able to get out of it.
Thanks, Eric. I think I have covered all the questions I've seen. Please, if there are, we still have time. If there are further questions, please enter them in the Q&A window. Just a remark. I think many of the sports analysts they write blogs, right? And they put their own analysis out there, and then I guess recruiters may find them if their blogs have a big impact.
So I see there's a question about how to show public domain work as a job seeker from Lyle Danley. There's a lot of ways of doing it. I think it depends what your portfolio looks like. I think if you have maintained a blog, it's easy to put on your resume, like, ran a blog, did this information. You have a couple bullet points on what it is and tell people where to find it. If you haven't, if your work is more like things that you've done for classes or for internships or for your own little fun, but not publishing in articles, then I think you do end up relying on things like a GitHub repository or a personal website. I think any of these is a reasonable way to give people a viewing into it. It just needs to be something that you can put on a resume and say, hey, go look at this and you can see more about me. And as a hiring manager, I can tell you, I will almost always go look and see what the person has done. And again, it's partly because it helps me know more about them as an applicant. It also is another one of these ways to see what people are thinking about out there and what information I might be able to make use of. So it for sure, it's something I would look at as a hiring manager. I often, in an interview process with a developer, will ask if they have public work that I can look at, because being able to look at their code and see what they do and how they go about it and what their strengths and weaknesses are, that sort of thing can be hard to assess in an interview environment. And so I can't speak for what all hiring managers do, but for me personally, I love when people give me access to see some of their thought processes, some of their coding, just give me a view into what you are like as a researcher.
Yeah, there are more questions. I'm sorry I missed that. A question from Taylor Caruso. Do you think getting an advanced degree is necessary to make you stand out as a candidate in the sports industry, or is it more experience, connection, and research-based?
It's not necessary. I think I think there's very big differences across teams. So remember, I went through that list of 100 people who had data adjacent jobs in the NHL, and something like 30% of them had a STEM degree, and something like 20% of them, it was an advanced degree. So that's probably not every team having 1 out of 5 employees having an advanced degree. It's probably, maybe half the teams have half their employees with advanced degrees. And so I think there are teams where it's a real advantage if you have shown more training. I don't think it's required anywhere, and I think there are teams where it's not necessarily that big of an advantage either. Every hiring manager is going to be different, and every role within a team is going to be different. And so I don't think there is a universal answer. I think it's going to depend on what kind of problem you want to be solving and where the where it's easiest to acquire the skills to solve that kind of problem, and also where it's easiest to demonstrate people that you've acquired those skills.
Question from Carlene Markey. If most teams go to private data providers, will that change with the advent of player puck tracking in the NHL?
Maybe. I would guess there are going to be different things from different teams. So one of the things that I think is probably pretty natural is to take anything that people have been doing by hand and ask, can we get that automatically out of the player and puck tracking data? And for some things, the answer might be yes. And then it's just a matter of investing resources into identifying those. But that's not always that easy. And not every team is going to have the time or inclination or ability to do that. And then there are some things you might be interested in that you can't get from player and puck tracking data. Right? So if I want to record how often a defenseman checks over his shoulder to see what's around him as he goes back for a puck, that's valuable information about how well he sees the ice, because you can't see the ice if you're not looking. That we wouldn't have from our tracking data, because we just have a point source saying where the player is and not whether his head is turned. And so there's information like that where his stick is positioned will not be in the play. And maybe you need to know that to assess things. And so I think there will still be a lot of things that where observational techniques or video analysis and computer vision techniques still play a role, even with puck tracking and player tracking. But I do think there are going to be some questions that we can answer with that without going to third parties.
Question from Broderick Prose. I've read a paper that argues that teams should be pulling their goalie way earlier in the third period, but are hesitant to take the chance for fear of backlash from fans and players. How do you bridge the gaps between analytics and the tradition of the sport?
Yep. Yeah, so I think that's something that people face in every sport. I think there are some places where it's pretty easy to help people. Look, ultimately, everybody wants to win. Coaches want to win more than anything else. And fear of backlash might play a role in some cases, but I think if they believe it's going to help them win games, they're generally going to want to do it. The challenge is they've spent their whole life becoming one of the world's leading experts in this, and everything they've ever done said this was the way to do it. And it can be hard to say, hold on, I've got some data that says that's wrong. And it's not going to be easy for someone who is as expert as they are to immediately drop their opinion. And by the way, they probably shouldn't. More often than not, their instinct is going to be right. And there's a reason why decades of experience led to that conclusion. But in the cases where they are, it really comes down to communication. And on the goalie pull, like, the math is moderately complicated, and it's probably not something that a coach is going to understand easily. But if I have a conversation that says, yeah, no, that intuition that you have that you wait until there's a minute left to pull the goalie was right back when you played. Because back when you played, teams scored 5 or 6 or 7 goals a game, and let's just wait another minute or two, we might get one here, was the right way to go. Nowadays, there's way fewer goals being scored, and so your intuition has to change. If you wait a minute, you're probably not scoring a goal in that minute, you're just wasting a minute of time. And so you need to start pulling the goalie early. And that's something the coach can say, yeah, okay, I get that. And that won't lead them to an answer about how much earlier, and you might still need to talk about what the math says to get there. But I think having that ability to communicate the reasoning behind what the models are showing and help people get a feel for why this counterintuitive result actually makes sense and the intuition might be off here, is what's really powerful in this kind of situation.
Thank you, Eric. I think we are getting to the end, but let's just take one more question, last question. This question is from Jeremy Burden. What types of studies or research do you do for the hurricanes, specifically to gain a competitive advantage over other teams from your analytics people?
Yeah, I mean, part of how we get a competitive advantage is not talking specifically about what we do. So there's a limit to how much I can answer that, but we do try to involve the use of data and quantitative information in just about everything we do. So it gets incorporated in different ways. We do different kinds of studies and provide different kinds of information, partly because you need different information for a question like which draft prospect is the best bet than for what should this player do at this point in time on the ice. Those are just fundamentally different kinds of questions that need different kinds of information. But also each group works differently. And the way that one group might need to see something to understand it and make the best use of it is different from the way another group might need to. And so I think there's a really wide variety of approaches in terms of what we look at, how we look at it, how we present it, that's really tailored to who our audience is within the team.
All right. Thank you very much, Eric.